Hello, my name is Bradley Alvisea. There's my Twitter handle. And I'm going to talk to you today about the game theory of developmental processes. This talk is for Dynamic Days XL 2021, and this is part of Contributed Session 6, Games Development and Pattern Formation. So we're going to talk about how three different things are related: variation, morphogenesis, and learning adaptation. And you can see examples of this down below. You can see Claude Shannon running his mechanical mouse Theseus through a maze as it learns spatial relationships. You can see these different types of bird egg that are all different shapes and colors. And then you can see this cellular automata forming a pattern. And so all these things involve agents, and all these things involve different interactions with the environment and with other agents. So to get a better handle on what we're talking about when we talk about developmental game theory, we want to talk about agents. And we're going to talk about some definitions of agents. So the general case is something we call developmental agents. And so these developmental agents take the form of cells, morphogenesis, or gene products. And you can imagine that cells come in many different types, morphogenesis comes in many different states, and of course gene products come in many different states as well. And these agents all emit states. So you can imagine that there's this process of morphogenesis that's emitting states, or this cell that's emitting states, or this gene that's emitting states, or gene products that emit states. And they all basically produce this suite of states or strategies. And a developmental game then is the strategic interactions of these states. So whether it's, it could be between the agent and nature, or it could be between two agents. And so the interactions will determine the game. And so you can see here sort of an example of this, where you have a developmental agent where you have this nondescript cell that forms three germ layers. And then those three germ layers form different parts of an anatomy. And this could be some sort of agent that behaves in the environment, has sensors, it has a central nervous system, and it has different body parts, and all those have a developmental origination. And you can see that there could be, say, for example, a game against nature, or a game between different agents, and there's, competition, cooperation, and all those things. A specific case of a developmental agent is an ontogenetic agent. And so an ontogenetic agent, it's an important distinction to make, because ontogenetic agents do not use cognition to execute behaviors. In the example we saw before, all those processes unfold, but there's no cognition, there's no intention behind the behaviors. And this is different from typical game theory, like say in economics, where you have rational strategies and things like that, where we assume certain types of optimal or suboptimal behavior. In this case, it's just simply strategies that are constrained by energetics or by other factors, and so that's all we assume. So instead, the intentional strategies that are used in ontogenetic agents are related to transformational processes, such as movement, differentiation, growth, and regulation. So, for example, in movement, there's something that's generated by muscle, and that it generates an intentional state, in the sense that it's definitely, say, moving left instead of moving right, but it's not cognitive. There's no reflexivity to this. And so one example of how ontogenetic agents can use this information and build themselves some sort of game is coordination between ontogenetic agents. So in this case, you have coordination that results from collective behavior over time. Or, you could also have perfect coordination, and you can assume this a priori. And so in this case, you have a bunch of agents that are cooperating in a game. They're, they have intentional behaviors that are generated, and those behaviors have payoffs, and those payoffs involve some sort of, energetic constraints or energetic costs. And so they're either, loosely or perfectly coordinated, because the game is such that the payoffs favor coordination. So we also want to talk about developmental trade-offs. And so we want to model the internal state of an ontogenetic agent to show how developmental trade-offs sort of shape the execution of a developmental game. And so in this case, we want to consider that any agent needs to maximally conserve energy. This is a law of physics, and it's a law of biophysics as well. And so an agent will naturally invest in one set of strategies over another, but it won't do this intentionally, This is just something that happens in development as the organism is developing or as the agent is developing. Energetic scarcity then can lead to a pure strategy suite. So if you have there's a lot of energetic scarcity, there might only be one strategy that's viable for the developmental agent. So they might only employ a single strategy. This can also change the composition of different agents, and this can lead to heterogeneity. So ontogenetic agents with more available energy have a greater degree of complexity with a capacity for a greater number of strategies. So you can see how this process works. You have these different trade-offs between heterogeneity and homogeneity depending on how much energy there is in the environment. Fitness could also serve a purpose of energetic scarcity. So if things are, there's a fitness imperative to keep the developing organism alive so that it can reach maturity, then that's also something that's similar to energetic scarcity. I'm just simply using that as an example. Another thing we want to consider is biological intentionality. So again, we go back to this idea that rather than assuming goal-directed behavior amongst the ontogenetic agents, biointentionality is a means to achieve some functional imperative or to improve individual fitness. And so this is an example of sort of biological intentionality. And I use this because I want to differentiate it from sort of cognitive intentionality. And so you can see examples though here, and you can see that these things, they look like maybe they're thinking or maybe they're definitely alive, but what's driving this? Well, this looks like goal-directed behavior, and yet maybe it isn't exactly the type of goal-directed behavior that a human agent would or some sort of animal would pursue. And so here you have like a cell colony that's moving in different ways and maybe oozing in a certain direction, or it may be moving along some polar coordinate system. So, biological intentionality, examples of this include phenotypic plasticity, cell migration, and excitation and inhibition circuits amongst neural connections. And so these are all things that are intentional processes that drive the game. So now I'm going to go through a number of examples of different types of developmental game to give you a better idea of how this plays out in terms of the actual structure of the game itself. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is zero-player games. And so zero-player games, an example of which is Conway's Game of Life. So in this game, this is Conway's Game of Life over on the left. And to the right, you can see how you can generate ND point processes, n-dimensional point processes. And you can see that this is what we kind of use in the Game of Life. This is a zero-dimensional aspect of it, is this point process, the single point that changes its state over time. And so cells operate at a point processes that emit a state of dead or alive in this game. So in this zero-player game, you have an ontogenetic agent. It's operating as a point in space, and it's emitting this state of dead or alive. So there's this no real, it's just generating the state. It's not really interacting with other players. All these points are just operating sort of independently. They could, be affected by the state of others, but they're not directly playing a strategy against some other agent. And so there's only an indirect influence on spatial dimensionality. There are a lot of lifelike attributes captured in these dimensions, but there's no real competition here. So this is an example of a zero-player game. And in applying this to development, we can look at things like Turing morphogenesis or reaction diffusion processes, where particles compose a population of zero-dimensional agents, and with the sort of substance they call morphogens act indirectly to transform populations into a spatial pattern. So again, you have these points in space, they're sort of turning on and off, and they're indirectly competing with one another, cooperating with one another, and they're forming these patterns over time. An equilibrium is reached when a stable morphogenetic pattern is achieved. So under developmental game theory, we can reach equilibria just like we can in normal game theory, but it's a little bit different in terms of the sort of where this limit is. So this is an example of a very simple payoff matrix for a zero-player game. Within this payoff structure, the cell will tend to stay alive. And you can see the payoff structure is 0.8 for alive and 0.2 for dead. So when the payoff is high for being alive, it'll stay alive. The payoff to stay alive increases when a particle is part of a pattern. So in this case, we can set the payoff to be higher when it's doing something that is reaching some sort of goal. some sort of biological goal, like being part of a pattern. This asymmetric payoff is determined by information. It could be local biochemistry or it could be global fitness. So when you're modeling the system of the game, you can set the payoffs in a way that reflects sort of something that perpetuates the system. But by contrast, we can look at another payoff matrix, and this is where you have dead and alive, and you have two different payoffs, and the payoffs are actually equal. So in the case of an alive cell, it's 0.5, and in a dead cell, it's 0.5. So there's no advantage to either being dead or alive. So with this payoff structure, the cell will vacillate between dead and alive over time, and it'll be an equiprobable proposition, and it will likely not lead to some sort of pattern formation because the payoff doesn't really favor one state or another. So this is zero-player games. Now, one-player games, an example of this is the game against nature. So in this case, an ontogenetic agent will play an intentional strategy against a quasi-random natural process. So quasi-random natural process is something like weather or entropy. And so the payoff structure here will be solely dependent upon a process-driven objective. So for example, an increase in fitness or a maximization of error correction. And the application of development here we're going to get into is a generic developmental process that we'll talk about as a game of developmental minesweeper. And so again, just to go over this example with the weather, this is a game against nature. This is a single rational player playing a pure or mixed strategy against nature, which is a random or mixed strategy. So a strategy in this case is carrying an umbrella or not carrying an umbrella when the weather is changing all the time. So you have a weather forecast here, and the weather forecast is generated by a discrete random pattern generator. So it's generating these patterns of weather. And the forecast that we make is an imperfect information. So the question is that the observer, do they have to carry an umbrella or not, knowing that the weather is always changing and that the forecast is imperfect information. So you can see that the observer strategy here is below U or N, it's an umbrella or no umbrella. And the payoff is whether you have an umbrella and it rains. If it doesn't rain and you have an umbrella, there's no payoff. And there's a positive payoff if you don't have an umbrella and it's sunny because you don't have to carry the umbrella with you. So you can see that there's this case where you don't have an umbrella, you get a -1 payoff because you get soaked. In the case where you do have an umbrella and it rains, you get 1. So this has a nice connection with something like reinforcement learning because it does reward the agent with every sort of correct guess of what nature is going to generate. And so just keep that in mind for right now. And then, think about that in terms of the game against nature. In this case, we're going to look at a very specific case, and this is the developmental minesweeper game. So this is a picture of the classic minesweeper game on the right. And minesweeper is a game between nature and a single ontogenetic agent. So the ontogenetic agent is doing the job of the player 1 in this minesweeper game. They're selecting different tiles and uncovering a piece of this landscape. And the idea is you can't select where the place where there's a bomb or a mine because you'll blow up and your game will be over. So the idea is not to pick a spot where there's a mine, and you get as much of the board uncovered as possible. And so if you can uncover every square but the squares where there are mines, you win the game. And so you can actually take this game and turn it into a developmental game by looking at this game where you have a two-dimensional genome. Imagine this is a two-dimensional genome, and the ontogenetic agent doesn't know where the mines are. In this case, the mines are lethal mutations. So the agent is picking spots in the genome, and some of these are lethal mutations. So the idea is that in this two-dimensional space, the agent is picking places to sort of express its genome, but it doesn't want to pick the lethal mutations. It wants to pick around that. And so the idea is these are generated by random processes, and the agent has to sort of predict where there's not a lethal mutation, but it has no information as to what's a lethal mutation. So that's the idea here. And so these null squares, it's interesting because this game has a fairly high set of degrees of freedom. So it's actually a fairly large search space. And so we can also add another information to be uncovered. The ontogenetic agent is also blind to these features. So we could actually add in like other types of beneficial mutations to the mix. And so the idea would be you'd pick, not only try to avoid hitting the lethal mutations, but also, you might randomly pick a beneficial mutation. And so that's another way to do this. And so this is a way to model sort of, the acquisition of traits or the acquisition of phenotypes in a very abstract way. So the next example I'm going to give are two-player games. So we're building up from 0 to 1 to two-player games. And this is an example that is particularly interesting because it draws from a very simple game, but it actually has some really interesting implications. So in this case, we're going to look at the game tic-tac-toe. And it seems like a pretty boring game, but it actually has a lot of nice properties for this. So there's actually in tic-tac-toe something called a first mover advantage. And this is where if you pick, like say the center square, if you start the game, you can always be on the offensive, and your opponent has to be on the defensive if they want to play an optimal game. And so the idea is that if both players play an optimal game, there's always a tie, and there's no, they always basically have this defensive move that they're making. So this is something called the first mover advantage. And so if we look at the timing of cell division and differentiation in an embryo, the first cells or cell lineages to differentiate determine subsequent activities of the embryo. They determine the spatial sort of breakdown of what the embryo should look like, and those cells then have like their preferred position and their preferred function. And this actually can be modeled using a Stackelberg equilibrium, or something we're actually calling a biological Stackelberg equilibrium. This is where you have optimal play by the ontogenetic agents, plus this first mover advantage of one cell lineage over another. And so this means that there's no clear winner. So for example, one cell lineage can't take over the embryo, but on the other hand, you have this structure, this semi-hierarchical structure of the embryo. It's something you might even call heterarchical. And so no one cell lineage or type of cell dominates the embryo. And so the idea is that, if you had these processes were runaway processes where there was clearly something that favored a certain type of cell, like a neuron or a skin cell or a muscle cell, they would dominate the embryo, but they don't. And so this is a way to explain this. So here you have an example from a paper from Biosystems from 2018 that we put out. This is an example of this first mover advantage in tic-tac-toe. And then here we have this in the embryo, so you have the cell 1 and cell 2. Cell 1 moves first by dividing, and so they have this. They're able to maintain this spacing, and then 2 divides. They're the second player. They're playing this defensive move so that 1 doesn't invade their space. This is in the third move. In the fourth move, the cell lineage 1 divides again, so you have 3 cells versus 2 cells, and then the fifth move. The cell, actually in this case, cell lineage 1 divides again, so you have 4 cells in 1 versus 2 and 2. In the sixth move, lineage 2 divides from 1 cell to 2 cells, or actually you have 3 cells at that point. The idea here is that you're mostly playing optimally, although you can see examples where there's a suboptimal move where lineage 1 divides twice on 2 moves, and so it's able to structure the embryo in a certain way. So if we model it using this first mover advantage model, we can see that in some cases there's suboptimal moves by some of the lineages. In some cases, both lineages play optimally, and we can then extend that result to look and see what exactly, the structure of an embryo looks like, the structure of a developing organism looks like, and maybe explaining why some of these things are asymmetrical or become asymmetrical over time. And so this embryo can be analyzed using a first mover Stackelberg game. There's an advantage in terms of size. So for differentiated tissues, this size advantage in lineage 1 can be explained or could be explained or utilized in terms of function or structure. Sublineages 1 and 2 are established, and 1 in this case clearly has a size position advantage. And the second move, of course, sublineage 1 divides, and then before 2, and that's an advantage to sublineage 1. And then in the third move, sublineage 2 divides, and that gives sublineage 2, it's able to maintain its foothold, in its space in the embryo, and then the fourth move, and then so on and so forth. And so you can actually do the same type of analysis or have the same type of game for connectome formation. So in the case of the formation of the C. elegans connectome, we actually published a paper in Frontiers in Cellular Neuroscience last year, where we looked at the synaptic connectivity data in C. elegans using a first mover model. And the idea here is that these circles are the cells, and these numbers are the birth times of the cells. And then we're using this synaptic connectivity data set to show that, synaptic connectivity emerges perhaps as a function of the birth time of each cell, perhaps not. And we're able to sort the data set into different strategies. So, there's this ambiguity in the literature as to whether birth time determines connectivity. And so, using this analysis, we're able to find that that's not always the case, but you do have these distinct strategies that where, if you have something that's born earlier, it must be first, or if it's born later, it must be first or second. And you can actually draw out some of these strategies, and these strategies are labeled. If you want more information, you can go to the paper. But these just basically explain how these connectivity patterns are established and what we should expect maybe in a more complex connectome. Then we go to something else in two-player games, another type of two-player game called the Prisoner's Dilemma, or the Iterated Prisoner's Dilemma. So this gives you individual versus group incentives. So again, we talked about cooperation early on in the talk. This is where you can actually model cooperation, and you can look at developmental games in terms of individual versus group incentives. So in a case where you have two ontogenetic agents, they can either cooperate or they can defect or not cooperate. And so when you defect, it's to seek maximization of an individual payoff, which is often suboptimal, but it just maximizes the individual payoff for whatever reason. So, in the case of the ontogenetic agents, they might not cooperate. They might end up, individually, benefiting in the short term, but the entire colony might die out as a consequence of that. So that's what I mean by suboptimal. In the case of the first mover games, of course, this does not apply, but this is specific to this type of game. If you, however, cooperate instead of defect, it maximizes the pairwise or group payoff. So in that example of the cooperating agents, they all basically are behaving in the same way, and they're cooperating, and it's maximizing their group payoff. So now the colony is the thing that's surviving, and maybe some individuals die off as a consequence, but the colony survives. In the iterated prisoner's dilemma, it's just an example of this example up in the upper right, the prisoner's dilemma. It's just that the game is repeated dynamically over time. So you have this repeated game that where the payoffs might change over time, but you get this function that shows basically the same trend, where the payoffs for defecting and the payoffs for cooperating might change, but you can get clear strategies over time. And an application of this to development is where you have a pair of ontogenetic agents with complementary mechanisms, such as pattern recognition. And so I meant to put pattern recognition and pattern generation in there, but I think I had it both words twice. So this is an example of what I mean. So this is the observer and the emitter. And so this is a game that we call it a morphogenetic game. And this is where you have the observer that reconstructs the pattern through perception from the emitter, which produces a pattern. So one exhibits morphogenesis and the other exhibits perception or attention. And so these two agents will compete against one another. And so this is answering the question, what is the relationship between morphogenesis and perception? If you have, say, for example, an ontogenetic agent that forms stripes, and they're doing it to avoid prey or some other reason, then what is the relationship, or avoid predators, then what's the relationship between the predator and the prey? That's what we're trying to maybe ask here. One of the possible questions we could ask. Using this model, we can treat this as either a predator-prey relationship or a competitive cooperative game, depending on what relationship the observer and emitter have. Some of this involves things like pareidolia or camouflage, and of course in pareidolia this is the evolution of perception, and morphogenetic mechanisms. This is the coevolution of those. In camouflage, you have this something called a matching pursuit game, which is a different type of game altogether, and also is part of this developmental game paradigm. And so, in this case, the predator hunts the prey, and the prey must conceal itself, or the prey is dangerous to the predator in some way, like say it kills with venom. And all those possibilities can be replicated in this game. So in this case, we have a pursuit evasion game, which is distinct from a prisoner's dilemma game. In this case, the observer tries to identify partial phenotypes, while the emitter tries to conceal its phenotype as a coherent pattern. So here you can see that actually this emitter isn't trying to conceal its pattern, but it could definitely, have different types of striping patterns over time. So, you have like in the first iteration, you might have this striped pattern. In the second iteration, you might have this checkerboard pattern. But this other agent that's trying to identify the pattern is then going through a series of patterns, possible patterns, to sort of figure out which pattern it is. And, there are a lot of things here to do with like spatial orientation and translation. So, this pattern might be at an oblique angle in the environment, and the agent still has to be able to recognize it. So if the agent can recognize that pattern, the payoff for that pattern is much lower than it otherwise would be. If it's a unique pattern that the agent's never seen before, that's also a very high payoff pattern for the emitter, and so on and so forth. So it relies on the learning of the observing agent and the ability to generate patterns on the part of the emitting agent. And so you can see there are interesting connections between this pursuit evasion utility function that you use in a pursuit evasion game. And this is a series of iterative payoffs. Like I said, these games change over time depending on the pattern that's being emitted by the emitter, and depending on what the observer has seen before or can learn or can identify in different contexts, this utility function changes. And there are connections between this pursuit evasion game and reinforcement learning. And so we're in the process of trying to figure out how to model this using reinforcement learning, and also using other types of putting developmental game theory in that context. So one of the things that this leads to then is something called developmental stable states. So in evolutionary stable states, which is the inspiration for this, you have a situation where, given a number of perturbations, strategies can be found that return the system to an initial state and resist invasion by mutant strategies. And so in the developmental stable state case, it might work in a similar manner. And it might mimic something called the canalization of development, which was proposed by Conrad Waddington. And on the right, you can see an example of the canalization of development. You can see the ball rolling down this hill and into the channels, or the canals, of this landscape. And so the idea is that developmental stable states would mimic this aspect of development. And finally, this just gives us a route, I think, in the future to understand combinatorial complexity more generally. So development is a very dynamic, unfolding process. It's a generative process, and you can see this from the epigenetic landscape, or from the transformation of a gamete into a full-blown organism. And so you can see this process of transformation and generativity and all these other aspects that exist in development. And it might actually give us insight into combinatorial complexity, which is the complexity of problems that have a lot of different moving parts and a lot of different degrees of freedom. So thanks for your attention. And if you want to join us in the DevoWorm group, there's our website. You can find more information. And thank you.